네, 여러분 반갑습니다. 2020
Good afternoon,
평창
ladies and
평화포럼
gentlemen.
DMZ 평화지대 첫
Welcome
번째
to
세션
Pyeongchang
모두
Peace
진행하겠습니다.
Forum, DMZ
여러분
Peace
함께하고
Zone
있는
Session 1.
강소리입니다.
I am
긴 시간
Moon-sori.
대세션에 참석해주고 계시는
Thank you very
많은
much for
분들께
your
진심으로 감사
participation.
인사드리면서 이곳에서 시작되는 평화의 이야기
And
여러분과 함께
I
하도록
would like
하겠습니다.
to
저희는
share the
이렇게
stories of
코로나19
peace with
상황으로
all of you. Due to
오늘부터야말로 많은 참석자
COVID-19,
여러분들
we
만나뵙게
are
되는데요.
joined by
이번
participants both
세션은
online and
2020 평창
offline.
평화포럼의
In this
DMZ
session, we're going to
평화지대 첫 번째
discuss the
세션이
meaning of
되겠습니다.
DMZ
이번
Peace
세션의
Zone, and this is
주제는
session number
신규
1 for this
평화체제와
topic.
DMZ
The theme of
비판적
the
접근을
session is
놓고
New Climate
계속되는데요.
Peace Regime and the
가장
Rights
먼저
of
평화의 성취가
DMZ.
피어나야 할 곳
DMZ
DMZ
is
주변에
the
들어가서
area where we
이곳을
can start the
평화하게
process of
선포합니다.
peace.
이번 세션은 지구와 사람 대표이신
Here in the
강금실
session, we
대표님께서
have with us
마당을 맡아서
Kang
함께
Gum-sil,
진행해
the Executive
주시겠습니다.
Director of
여러분께
People for Earth, who
소개드리겠습니다.
will moderate the
대표님
session.
모셨습니다.
I will hand it over
안녕하세요.
to Ms. Kang.
초대받은
As introduced, I am Kang Gum-sil.
지난해 평창
Last
평화포럼에서
year,
DMZ
at the
세션을
Pyeongchang
하기
Peace Forum, there
위해서
was the DMZ
DMZ
session.
평화지대와
And
연관한
once again,
세션으로
this year, we're having the DMZ Peace Zone session number 1.
논의를 하게 돼서
I'm very
굉장히
happy to be
기쁘게
part of this
생각합니다.
discussion on
오늘
promoting
제목을
peace in the
보시면
DMZ area.
신한반도
As you can see
평화체제와
in the title of the
DMZ의
session,
벌적
New
접근.
Climate Peace
아마도
Regime and the
상당히
Rights of
그
DMZ
개념이
is what
좀
we're going to
낯설다는
discuss.
느낌을
You
받으실
may
것
think that some of the
같습니다.
concepts are not very
오늘의
familiar.
그 문제 의식은 지금
In the
현재
session, we're going to discuss
DMZ가 한반도 한가운데에
the
70년
location of
동안
DMZ that is
역사적으로
at the center of the Korean
혁명의
Peninsula.
공간이 됐다는
This
점에서는
was in the
상당히
past
의견들이
the area for
일치가
division, but now
되어지는데
DMZ is
어떻게
becoming a
접근해
space
나갈
for
것이냐
peace and
DMZ의
reconciliation.
현재와
And how
미래
can we
한반도
approach the DMZ
평화에서
area in
우리가
connection
어떤
with the
접근을 해야
Korean
할 것인가
Peninsula
하는
and peace?
방법론에 대해서
We're going to
새로운
discuss
제안을 해보는
specific
자리입니다.
proposals and new methods,
신기후 평화체제는
especially in the framework of
잘
new climate
아시겠지만
regime.
중국 정부가
As you may know,
2060년까지
by
탄소
2060,
중립화 선언을 했고요.
China
바이든
said that
정부는
it would become net
신기후
zero,
협약을
carbon
개시를
zero,
해서
and President
적극적으로
Biden said the US
세계
would
기후 위기
go back to the
문제를
Paris
해결해
Agreement and
나가는
address climate change
협력하겠다는
actively.
선언을 했습니다. 이런 신기후
Now we
체제는
have this new climate regime putting in
협력이
place,
우선적으로
and this means
필요로 하는
that cooperation
것이기
among
때문에
countries around the
이것이
world is necessary to
한반도에서
respond to climate
물론
change.
북한도 기후 협약에 가입이 돼 있죠.
And
남북의
DPRK
협력 또 전
is also a
세계
signatory
국제
of
사회에서의 협력
the Paris
이런
Agreement as well as
관점에서
South Korea. So from the
DMZ가 있는
perspective of climate
한반도와
change
어떤
and
연관성을
environment, we can
두고
discuss
접근할 수
the
있겠는지
implications of
그리고
DMZ for this
그것은
cause.
한반도의 평화를
And
새롭게
this is once
접근하는
again about
신기후 체제라는 시대적
implementing
상황과
this new
새로운
peace
평화 논의가
and climate
어떻게
regime
연결될
on the
것인지
peninsula
이거를
and
두고자
connect this to
합니다.
our
오늘
discussions
아침
on
10시에
peace.
청년들
At 10
생태
a.m. this
균형과
morning,
연관된 세션을
there was an
했는데
ecological
기후 위기
session with
문제를
young people,
다뤘습니다.
and
그
we
자리에서
discussed the issue of
청년
climate
부산
change.
기후 운동
And at that time,
활동가이신 이나경
we
씨가
had
굉장히
Lee
인상
Na-kyung,
깊은
a
말씀을
climate
하셨어요.
activist, and she made
군사
something very
영역에서의
interesting.
이산화탄소 배출에
In
대해서
the
우리가 잘
militarized
알지
areas, we have
못하다는
to
것이죠.
recognize
이것만
carbon emission
봐도 기후
situations.
위기와 이
And this really
군사의
shows
포괄적
that there is a
그
nexus between
비무장화가 얼마나 연결되어 있는지를
demilitarization
우리가
and
실감할 수가
environment and
있습니다.
climate change.
신기후 평화 체제가 이러한 시대적
And
굉장히
so,
절박한
new
기후
climate regime
시대의
is something that
협력과
the
방북
international
협력,
community
한반도의
has to
평화와
promote
관련된
together
관점에서
because it is very
문제를
much related to
제기한다면
peace and
DMZ의
environment on the
벌적
Korean
접근은
Peninsula. In that
작년
sense,
평창 평화
the rights of
포럼에서
DMZ is
소개했던
something that we need to
지구법에
consider
근거해서
seriously. And
이
this is
어떻게 DMZ에
related to
접근할 것이냐 DMZ
the
그
Earth
자체의 그 접근하는
governance
방법으로
regime that was
DMZ
introduced
안에
last year at Pyeongchang Peace
존재하는
Forum.
생태 공간 그 자체 거기 살고
Now,
있는
the
생명의
Earth is the
관점에서
ecological
자연의
environment
논리
where we
관점에서
live
이걸
in.
접근해
We
보자는
should
것이죠.
approach the
그렇게 해서
DMZ from an
이
ecological
신기후 평화
perspective
체제의
under the notion of
문제의식과
Earth
DMZ의 벌적
Jurisprudence.
접근이라는 새로운
In that sense,
접근법을
we
함께
can
통합해
consider adopting
가면서
this new
새로운
approach
그
to the
미래를 열어가는
DMZ
걸
by
지켜보고
discussing
싶고
its relations to new
또
climate regime.
DMZ로 이 모든 문제 전 지구적
And as we are addressing global challenges and the political and social issues and the Korean Peninsula issues and inter-Korean issues, in addressing all of these global challenges, we can zoom them on to the DMZ
이런
area.
시도들이
These attempts are quite new. As such, we will have an opportunity to listen to the speakers discussing these very new notions and how we can apply these new notions in addressing global challenges. You may think that our discussions are rather abstract and high level, but I hope that you will continue to provide us with your support and interest. Before we move on to the presentations, let me introduce the speakers. During the Obama administration, he served as an advisor on climate change. Here with us, we have Professor Nathan Holtman from the University of Maryland, and he will be the first speaker. He is going to discuss the Biden administration's vision for global cooperation for climate action. And secondly, we have Professor Lee Il-young from Hanshin University. He's going to discuss the meaning of new Korean Peninsula regime proposed by the Moon administration. He's going to make critical comments, and he will also discuss how we can apply the ecological perspective in approaching the new Korean Peninsula economy regime. This is a very important theory. It means that on the Korean Peninsula, there are many overlapping international issues, and we can address these issues by utilizing networks and cross-border discussions. And I look forward to his presentation. And next, with respect to the rights approach to the DMZ, we have with us Professor Louis Kotze from Northwest University. He's going to talk about the potential of the Earth Jurisprudence and Earth Framework, and he's going to discuss the global approach to this topic. And we have with us Professor Rakhyun Kim of Witwatersrand University. He is doing research on global governance for environment, and to be more specific, he's going to discuss how migratory bird passages can be utilized in promoting peace in this region. And for our panel discussions, we have with us Ms. So-young Lee, a member of the National Assembly. She's an expert on environment, and she was one of the proponents of the inter-Korean environment law. And so there will be a discussion by Ms. Lee So-young. And finally, we have Professor Byung-jin An from Kyunghee University. He is the one who proposed this topic for the DMZ Peace Zone Session 1. He's going to discuss the political implications of new climate peace regime. And when we have time, we're going to have some Q&A session because you can ask questions on the board, or we will facilitate dialogues among the speakers and the panel members. My introduction was rather lengthy, so let's go right into the presentations. Thank you.
헐트만 교수님 부탁드립니다.
Professor Holtman.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to the organizers for convening this wonderful forum. I'm very excited to be part of such an excellent series of talks and conversations, and I really affirm and support the goals of the forum and the way in which you're having conversations and encouraging dialogue. So it's really my great pleasure to be here. My name is Nate Holtman. I'm the director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. I work on climate change. I've worked for the previous administration, the Obama administration, in the White House on our climate policy. And for the past few years, I've been working to better understand the potential impact of subnational action on US emissions trajectories and how we might, in the US, build a more ambitious climate policy in the next couple of years. So thank you again for having me, and I'm excited to share my talk with you. Thinking about our world and thinking about the opportunities that we have this year is actually a very exciting prospect. We are facing a number of challenges, but we also face a number of potential opportunities through collaboration and cooperation. And one of those areas is climate change. And I've been working in the topic of climate for a while. I worked in the Obama administration for a couple of years on our climate policy, and for the past few years have been working with the US subnational community and the international community on advancing climate action. So I'm very excited to be at this moment with you all and with the global community to be thinking about what we might do together in 2021 and beyond. So the way I think about this is that we are currently facing at least, maybe more, but at least 4 linked crises. Climate change is one, which is of course the subject of this talk. But we also are very much facing deep problems across our world in other ways. A global pandemic of COVID-19, the economic recession and other economic impacts that are affecting people around the world, and also global justice and democracy, thinking about making sure that those around the world have opportunities and rights equal to all. And it's in the context of these 4 crises that I think we need to start our discussion about climate change. Obviously, climate change has been a problem we've known about for a long time, but I think there's a particular moment right now that we're facing. And the main point that I want to say about these 4 crises is that we cannot solve any one of these crises without thinking about and making actions to address all 4 of the crises. And so climate change is appropriately seen in the context of our own national strategies to deal with all of these linked crises. And I see 2021 as a moment of opportunity in this context. We've been working toward climate action, again, as I said, for many decades. What I'm showing you here on this slide is from not quite a year ago, a little over a year ago, in 2019, when we saw the youth movement around the world take action to call attention to climate change, to call world leaders to do something more. And what I think we're seeing in 2021 as we emerge from the pandemic is a harnessing of this energy helped by our youth around the world, but also taken up by everybody around the world, including those a little more senior, to pick up this action and actually have the opportunity to make decisions and to drive forward on a collaborative spirit of action this year. And I will tell you a little bit more in the talk what I mean by that. Putting this in a little bit of scientific context, a couple of years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released what is now a famous report telling us how rapidly we need to adjust our global economy to respond to the urgent crisis of climate change. And what you see here on the left-hand figure is essentially an indication graphically of how rapid we need to take our emissions down to 0 or near 0 by the middle of this century, somewhere between 2040 and 2055. What you see there on the left is the historical record of emissions up to about 2020, where we are today, and then a rough approximation of how rapidly we need to draw down global emissions to reach our scientifically informed climate goals. On the right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but on the right, what we see is a rough estimation of how much we need to reduce different kinds of emissions, so CO2 or carbon dioxide, but also that implies how rapidly we need to reduce, for example, energy from coal, implying something like an 85 to nearly 100% reduction in energy from coal, and probably more than a doubling of renewables. So the point of this slide is just to underscore the urgency of action, and also to note not just the urgency, but the sustained rapidity or speed of that action. That will mean that we all feel and see changes in our economies and in our day-to-day lives between now and 2030. Things like that would mean, for example, that we're taking electric vehicles instead of gasoline vehicles. In my own country, General Motors, a really big car company, just announced it's going all electric as of 2035. You may have heard of other such announcements, and several in Europe and around the world. Some manufacturers are even looking at 2030 as a moment where they will stop manufacturing traditional internal combustion engines. And that's just one example of the many kinds of changes that we will be experiencing. So I'm excited about 2021 because we are seeing different trends coming together to allow us to refocus global climate effort on making changes this year. And I put these in a couple of categories. First, there are international actions taken in the global community. For example, under the Paris Agreement on climate change, which is our current international agreement that governs how countries behave and how countries commit to taking climate action, countries around the world are asked to reduce their national emissions and report on what their national targets are to the international process this year. There's now an integrative focus led by the COP presidency, the international body presidency, to focus on subnational action, nature, finance, adaptation, resilience, and more. And there's also a global movement toward net zero targets. This was not even a thing a couple of years ago. Now we're seeing not only countries, but also businesses, investors, cities, and many others taking on targets to net zero emissions by mid-century. There are also two big events happening this year. Actually, there's multiple events. I've highlighted two here. One is in my country, convened by President Joe Biden, of a global leaders summit on Earth Day in April. And at that summit, we in the United States will be getting back in the international community and talking to world leaders about what we intend to do about climate change. Of course, I'm sure you agree with me that that is a welcome change, and we're all excited about what this new administration will be announcing. In addition, later this year, there's the major international summit to deal with climate change in Glasgow in the UK. And those leaders are coming together to make new commitments, make new promises about where we're going to be going. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but I wanted to underscore that this is a year where we've actually already been seeing a tremendous number of actions being taken by other countries. China just came out just a couple of months ago, and President Xi made a commitment to a goal of net zero emissions by 2060, or carbon neutrality by 2060, and a peak by 2030. I'm just going to give a few highlights here. The UK has said it will go 68% below 1990 levels by 2030. Denmark, for over a year now, has set a target of 70% below 1990 levels and has also agreed to go net zero. The EU has agreed to go net zero with a 55% reduction target. Korea has agreed to go net zero. Japan has agreed to go net zero. And the United States, we will see. Although I have to say, Joe Biden has already committed in his campaign to going to net zero. So that is probably one of the announcements that he'll be making over the course of this year. But I wanted to take a moment and explain to you a little bit about what I see is happening in the United States, because I know a lot of people have been curious about what's been happening here, and also what I see as the prospects for how we might re-enter into the world of climate action in the very near future, and what that means for climate action more broadly. So we have a pretty consistent view. I think there's a standard view of what climate action has looked like and will look like in the US. And what you see here is 3 photographs of the different presidents. You all know them by now. So we have, of course, Barack Obama, known for being a very pro-climate active president. We have Donald Trump, who is also very well known, but in this case for going the opposite direction. Here's a picture of him saying he's withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. And then finally, in recent days, we have the new president, Joe Biden, also taking actions to address climate change. Now, in many places around the world, what is seen is the leadership at the top. And it's understood that the leadership at the top matters. That is absolutely true. I will not argue with you at all on that. I firmly believe it. But what is harder to see is what goes on beyond the leadership. So the conventional way to look at this is that under Barack Obama, we had increased climate action. Donald Trump reduced the climate action. And then, of course, the expectation is that Joe Biden will ramp it up again. Now, that's to some degree correct. But I want to give you a more subtle story of what's been happening in the US. And that's what I want to show you on the next 2 or 3 slides. So over the course of the past few years, after Donald Trump came into office and made his announcement that he was going to withdraw from Paris, we saw a tremendous groundswell of effort across the different states, cities, businesses, investors, communities of faith, healthcare organizations, tribal groups, universities, and many more, saying that they were going to take action in their own institutions or in their own jurisdictions about climate change. Now that is exciting. And one of the activities that I've been involved in over the past few years has been to actually try to better understand how genuinely exciting it is. Because it's one thing to have a number of institutions step up and sign a document. It's another thing entirely to have them make real commitments that will actually make a difference to the emissions trajectory of a country. And that was the job I was involved in, and others were involved in this too. And I think that that tells an incredibly strong story that has resonance not only for climate action in the US, but for climate action globally, and in fact for action outside of climate change as well. So one of the things I want to point out is that this coalition of actors represents a GDP roughly the size of China's, the world's second largest economy. And the impact that they've been able to have already has been large, and it actually could grow even further. One of the things I want to note is that even just in the past few years, there's been tremendous action at this subnational level, a doubling of electric vehicles, 16 states, including California and other large states, committing to phase down of something that's a super pollutant called HFC. It's a high potency greenhouse gas, and that essentially amounts to a de facto standard. Many, many states and cities have now taken on clean electricity or clean energy commitments, now up to 13 states and 165 cities. We have 7 states and 25 gas companies committing to methane leak reduction. 6 million people across the US now live in cities with all electric new construction requirements. And finally, something approaching 80% of Americans think the country should prioritize renewable energy when we're building out our infrastructure. So what I want to say in very brief is that this tells a different story. And the work that I've been involved in indicates that this subnational part of the US federal system has not only been sort of carrying climate action during the Trump years, but is also in fact building a better basis for additional climate action now. So instead of the old view where we have kind of an up and down and up again, what we see is that yes, climate action did increase under Obama. Trump did have a negative impact, but the coalition of actors under Trump actually made a pretty big difference even over the past couple of years. And we have the analysis to support this. This is just a diagrammatic representation. And then that gives a stepped up basis for accelerating action under the federal government now that Joe Biden is in control and now that there's a democratically controlled Congress. And so what that means is a different kind of story than many people kind of, I think, saw with Donald Trump being a very visible and very, if I can say it, hard to avoid presence in our global conversation. That there was in fact good work happening that in fact has taken the US into a better place than we were in many ways even a few years ago. And so what that means is that we can actually reduce our emissions by something like 50% by 2030, which is somewhat in line with those other targets that I told you before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this figure, but I would refer you to the report if you're at all interested. So where we are today then is that we now have a president and a team in the federal government that is committing to climate action. But I think the important thing is shown on the right-hand side here. First of all, that climate is one of the top 3 priorities of this administration, and that they're going to be working with states, cities, businesses, and citizens in an all-in strategy to deliver on an ambitious climate target. So that's the story of the United States. And what I want to say in conclusion is that I think that this story has a lot of resonance for us as global citizens and people in our own national contexts. Basically, if you look at the figure on the right, I think it's helpful to think about climate action happening as a function of 3 interlocked and interlinked sets of activities. One, of course, we all understand international climate coordination, for example, through the UN, is extraordinarily important. That's always been the case. It always will be the case because climate is a global problem and we do need to be working with each other to solve it. We also know on the left-hand side of the figure there that national climate policies are essential. National levels are often where the most strong legislation can come from, and it's often where most of the regulatory actions happen. So national climate policy is clearly critical for a rapid transition toward a low carbon economy. But one thing that I just want to underscore is that the bottom-up climate action not only helps support higher national policy, but it also builds the groundwork for more robust and long-term national climate policies that support higher global ambition. The way we do this is because all those organizations are now bought in and participating in the climate actions that support the national climate policies. So when I think about what we can do together, it's first of all building a basis for ambition and implementation through this subnational action. Second, pressing our global and national leaders for higher national ambition and cooperation. Third, at this time where we're re-emerging from COVID and where we have new leadership in the United States, I think it's critically important to reestablish global alliances for supporting increased action from individual countries and from the global international community. And finally, in all of our countries, we work with shared goals to recover from COVID, to address the justice and equity crisis, to respond to our economic slowdowns and build new innovative growth pathways with what I call broadly shared prosperity. So prosperity that goes to everybody, that's broadly shared so that all can partake in the benefits of a clean and healthy economy. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'm happy to talk with the panel.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Holtman.
우리 헐트만 교수님 말씀을 통해서 굉장히
Through his presentation, I have been quite inspired by two things. When President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, many people were quite worried, but we could see that states, cities, businesses, industries, and other groups have made their own subnational efforts. That is quite inspiring. And the fact that it will lead to a synergy effect for the Biden administration is quite inspiring. The U.S. has a target of reducing 50% by 2030. That was the evaluation of Professor Holtman. I think this brings us to the concern of Korea. Of course, we have the announcement of net zero by 2050, and we have enacted laws concerning the Green New Deal. But at the same time, in statistical figures, we can see that we are a great polluter. So we don't have actual reduction efforts. And so we need to call for more efforts on the part of the government. And Professor Lee Il-young's presentation on the new Korean Peninsula scheme is something that we should talk about. During the centennial anniversary of the March 1st independence movement, President Moon announced this new initiative. Let's turn to Professor Lee.
네, 교수님.
Professor Lee.
안녕하십니까?
Good afternoon, everyone. As introduced, I am Lee Il-young.
여보세요?
Hello? We can hear you. Yes, yes.
네.
So please go ahead with your presentation. And would you maybe look up a little bit?
평창 평화포럼에 초대해
Thank you very much for your invitation to Pyeongchang Peace Forum. What I'm going to discuss in my presentation is our understanding of the new Korean Peninsula regime. I'm an economist,
저를 설명할 때
but when I introduce myself,
하려고 하는 게 아니고
I don't want to stay within the realm of economics only, but I would like to also look at more of a holistic implications of phenomenon in our economy by looking at the social aspect as well. In 1988, there is a journal called Outlook and Trend, and I've been involved with this journal, and for a long time, I have been doing some critical analysis of economic policies.
그래서 그 비평이라는 영역을
So
통해서
through
우리가
journal
실천적으로
publications,
어떻게
I've been trying to change our reality and change our world by implementing
한반도 체제를 어떻게 볼 것인가
various
하는
actions. Now, when it comes to our interpretation of the new Korean Peninsula regime,
요점을
that
말씀드리면
was the given topic.
신한반도체제론이라는
But
것은 현재
to
한국
be short,
정부의 그 정책
the
비전이라고 볼 수
Korean
있습니다. 제가
government has proposed
판단하기로는
a new vision called the new
가장
Korean Peninsula
포괄적인 영역을
regime.
담고
And in
있는
my understanding, this is indeed the most
국제관계까지
or the broadest
포함된
concept that includes not only the domestic affairs but also the regional affairs. It is a broad direction and a very ambitious vision.
이게 체제를 얘기하고 있거든요.
But this is once again about a system and a regime which is comprehensive. So in that sense, it is quite positive and it has been much of a progress. That's my evaluation of the regime.
그 평창 평화 포럼에서 던지는
And here at the
도전적인
Pyeongchang
문제가
Peace Forum,
있습니다.
I would like
이게
to
이제 그 체제론이
raise
안아야
some
될
questions because when we say this is a regime and this is a system, and we need to take a step further.
제가 그쪽 그 논의해온 게 이제 한반도 경제론인데
I've been proposing the Korean Peninsula economic theories, and I believe that this new Korean Peninsula regime does include some elements of the Korean Peninsula economic theory. I may be too proud about my theory, but
론이라는 게 이제 현실
when you look at the new Korean Peninsula regime, this is indeed a government policy that should be realistic. And there are many elements that need to be further defined in order to implement this policy. In that sense, the regime, this proposal does not include all the ideal components in it. So there are some limitations.
평화 포럼에서 끌어줘야 되는
And this is something that I believe we need to discuss at this Pyeongchang Peace Forum.
말씀드린 거는 이제 제가 그 제기하고 있는
Therefore, in my presentation, I'm going to raise some issues and questions about the new Korean Peninsula regime, and then I'm going to discuss what implications these issues have for the regime. And then I'm going to move on to the ecological perspective and the ecological objectives.
더 나가야 됩니다.
In what direction do we need to advance this regime, and what else do we need to do to complement this regime idea?
제가 미처 사실 이게 생태주의 부분에 철저하지 못하고
My presentation may not be thorough about the ecological perspective. I may offer some benign
우리가 얼마만큼 더
perspectives, but I would like to once again challenge you to further advance your thinking about the ecological aspect of the Korean Peninsula regime.
강금신 장관님께서
As
말씀하셨는데
Kang Keum-sil mentioned, in 2019, at the March 1st Independence Movement celebration, there was the speech by President Moon, and he declared this new Korean Peninsula regime during his speech.
구체화되지 않고 있는
But this regime idea has not been conceptualized in a detailed manner. In addition, when you think about the conceptual level and the philosophical level, there are some limitations, and this notion of new Korean Peninsula regime has not been advanced sufficiently. And there are gaps between the reality and the theoretical aspect of the regime.
비평을 하는 입장에서는 이제
As someone who's offering critical analysis of economic policies, this is something that I can say. And so I'm going to include my own opinions and evaluations about the regime as well. And I'm going to also criticize my own thinking about the ecological approach to the Korean Peninsula regime.
관점을 이제 저는 2000년대 초반부터
Since early 2000s, I've been discussing Korean Peninsula economic theories. I may not have enough time to delve into this theory in detail, but I'd like to say that democratization in Korea was very rapid and it was quite successful. And there are elements of nationalism that have been a driving force behind democratization. In 1987, there was a lot of progress in democratization, and in the 1990s, globalization was a global trend, and there were many challenges in this regard. So what I like to say is that Korean nationalism and our own national ethnic identity, how have they been connected with globalization? This is something that we need to discuss. As Professor Holtman mentioned, since 2019, there has been a lot of action, and 2021 can be a year of opportunity. And I was quite inspired by his remarks. And this is indeed a new year, and this is a year where we can take on new challenges and be more critical in our thinking. When you take a look at the characteristics of the Korean Peninsula economic theory, it argues for the need to have a holistic approach because there are multi-dimensional aspects. But so far, policies have been rather singular in their dimension, and there was lack of holistic approach, and there was a lack of connection between the reality and the policies and the theory. So we need to have a holistic approach and apply a holistic perspective in promoting economy on the Korean Peninsula. And as Holtman mentioned, national level policies are important, but we need to go over the beyond, or go over the limits of national boundaries, and we need to move beyond nationalism to have a broader vision for the region. And in that sense, we should pursue network approach and regionalism and Korean Peninsula as a large system. As I mentioned, in 2019, President Moon proposed a new Korean Peninsula regime. And before that, there were some efforts to improve the inter-Korean relations, and these efforts were reflected in this new proposal. But when you take a look at the messages of the Korean government, there are two different levels, and they may contradict each other. But in reality, our reality is filled with contradictions. And this is what we have to accept as part of the reality because our world is not neatly defined as we would try to do it on the whiteboard. And there are many contradictions you can find in President Moon's speeches on many different occasions because there are messages given to the Korean people versus messages given out to the international community. For instance, when you take a look at President Moon's speech on March 1st, Independence Day, he said that Korea will be a leader, and he discussed peaceful cooperation community and economic cooperation community. But when you take a look at the written message of President Moon to a German newspaper, he discussed the greatness of being ordinary and a peace of ordinary people and inclusive global order. So in this article, he did not discuss the leadership role of Korea, but rather he discussed being more global and pursuing global order. And at Oslo Forum, President Moon talked about peace that will transform our everyday lives. So his ideas were quite liberal, but moving on to his domestic message, you can see that to the Korean audience, President Moon once again invoked nationalism. On the Liberation Day celebration, he talked about being one nation that cannot be shaken. And so he talked about the nation, the state, the country, one Korea that will be achieved through unification and peace. So when you take a look at these messages, on one hand, he would invoke the idea of nationalism and being one state, and on the other hand, he would talk about inclusive messages and being liberal and open and inclusive. So there are some contradictions. So I've been raising issues about these contradictions, especially in international relations and political science. You have to really talk about the state as a notion, as a unity, as a unit, because this is, of course, very important for international relations. But moving on to President Moon's remarks, he's been talking about the notion of community that goes beyond the scope of a nation or a state. But who constitutes these communities? They're once again states, national states.
아닌 어떤 그런 주체들에 대해서 우리가
So there are, of
좀
course, national states
비판하고
in our reality, but then we have to expand our imagination to go beyond the scope of national or sovereign state. And this is what I've been emphasizing over and over again.
그래서 국가가 주체가 된 어떤 주권적 영토를
Now,
말해서
we have to overcome the limits of a sovereign territory, but you have to think about the components of a community. Then there can be many different actors,
관계가 중요하다.
and relations among these actors would be very important.
확장시켜 나가는 것이
And that's how we can expand our discourse on this regime idea, and that's my idea.
피난반도 체제를 얘기하면 거기에
As we're talking about the new Korean Peninsula regime, this is a regime, this is a system. But once again, if we emphasize Korea as a state or as a country, then it may be viewed as part of nationalism. So this is something that we need to be careful about.
민감하고
And once again, this can be very sensitive, and some people would capture this contradiction, and especially those who are specialized in ecology would point this out
주동적으로 가는 부분이
very accurately. And of course, a nation state would have to take the leadership role, but at the same time, it has to listen to the voices of other stakeholders and actors, and we have to let them voice their opinions and take some leadership role as well. And in doing so, it should not be just the central government, but also local government. And at the same time, Korea can be a leader in the regional community, and in doing so, we should build networks. And there are people who are out there who are even more sensitive towards this compared to myself, and there are people who are ecologists. And I would rather be seen as conservative compared to these people who are quite progressive. And so we have to keep their voices in mind.
현실의 어떤 정책 전략으로 내려오게 되면
When you go down to the level of strategies, you can find a lot of these areas where there can be some limitations and contradictions.
피난반도 체제를 핵심적으로 구성시키는
There may be several strategies behind the new Korean Peninsula regime. They are the peace strategy and economic strategy, and of course, these strategies are important.
평화경제론을 제기하면서
And as I was proposing for peace economy, you can see that North Korean and South Korean economies are connected within the system, within the regime.
이걸 통해서 저는
And peace economy would be achieved within this regime. And so in that sense, I believe that the understanding and the perception of the Korean government has been expanded.
자기만 하니까
Of course, government officials may not recognize this, but in my understanding, I can see that there has been an expansion of the understanding. So when you take a look at the overall discourse, I believe it is important progress and advancement that they're talking about a regime or a system instead of staying with the notion of a national state. So in that sense, it is a lot of it is progress,
더 못 나가고 있는 측면이
but
있어요.
there are limitations
민족주의
because there are notions of nationalism and sovereign state. And if you only stay within these concepts, then you cannot move beyond these boundaries. You fail to reach out to the global level. So far, there have been a lot of discussions on inter-Korean economy and making Korea a big nation that cannot be shaken by external forces. So in these discussions, you can see the notion of a sovereign state. But I think we have to broaden our notion, broaden our understanding. We have to talk about global and regional community. Together with North Korea, we should promote a new Korean Peninsula economy that is much larger than the Korean Peninsula.
피난반도 체제론에서 보면
And when you take a look at this new Korean Peninsula regime, you can find some overlap between the new Korean Peninsula regime and ecological theories.
아직 기후변화와
But
인권의
nevertheless, right now, the virtuous cycle of human rights and environment have not been put in place or have not been firmly established. And this is something that we need to all reflect on, especially for my theory of Korean Peninsula theory as well as the new Korean Peninsula regime.
수준에 머물러 있다.
And I would also like to point out that the new Korean Peninsula regime is rather
여러
abstract,
논의들이
and we
만나야 된다.
should work to
제가 이제
make operational concepts.
느끼게 된 그런
So these will be the critical evaluations of the new Korean Peninsula regime
한반도
proposal.
체제에 대해서 보면 생태주의자들이 본격적으로 논의를 하고 있지는 않아요.
There has not been an active discussion on this topic by ecologists. So far, they have not been that active in making this discussion, but I've been involved with another journal where we had a special edition on ecological perspectives, and ecologists would be, I was able to learn that they are very sensitive to these issues. When it comes to improving the inter-Korean relations and establishing the new Korean Peninsula regime, they criticize that these proposals lack ecological components. And they would say that if we exclude discussions on ecology, then such proposals will not be successful. So there are all these writings that have been produced in criticizing the new Korean Peninsula regime, and you can find all these quotations. Because so far, many discussions have been on development, and priority has been placed on development and expanding the territories and lands for development. And in response to this, ecologists would be very critical and they would oppose to the existing discussions because we need to cater to ecological aspects. We need to put priority on environment as well. Now, when you look at these ecological discourse on the Korean Peninsula regime, I believe that this is very much related to agricultural and farm movement. And in the US and also in China, there are discussions on how to advance agriculture in an ecological manner. And there are some tensions between urban and rural theories. And I believe that my theoretical background is more rooted in agriculture and farm-related aspects. But at the same time, I think we have to promote harmony between these two sides. In Korea, when I talk to people who are studying ecology, they seem to favor and idealize micro-farming and organic farming and small farming and the value of small farming. And I think we can apply this notion in an urban setting as well. And recently, Michael Davis published a book called the Anthropocene, and was talking about what kind of arc we need to build in this new era. And in the urban settings, we need to find elements of farming and agriculture. And that way, we can promote harmony between rural and urban areas. So I've been trying to apply ecological perspectives to the new Korean Peninsula regime, and there can be several proposals. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and we need to make further progress. In Korea, nationalism is something that we cannot avoid. But when you think about the inter-Korean relations and the China, Russia, and the US, these large companies are surrounding the Korean Peninsula. So we have to also address international existence. And we are a sovereign state, but at the same time, we're a member of the international community. And at the same time, we belong to Earth Jurisprudence. So we should be able to make connections between these three different levels. And we need to find a space or platform for that. So specifically, we can come up with a project of connecting Seoul and Chugaryong Valley and Wonsan. This can be a new belt that will connect the ecological systems of the two Koreas, and this can be a Korean Peninsula peaceful ecological area project. So this is an idea that we can consider. And the late Kim Seok-chol also had a similar idea. And there were discussions about this and some panel discussions about this. So centered on land property, of course, the land-related law is quite strong. So rather than being rooted on the land property, we can pursue this type of project by utilizing the waterways. And by tapping into this waterway and water resources, we can create a new ecological space for the two Koreas. And this is something we can implement. So the Chugaryong Valley has the source of its a watershed, and we can connect this to the surrounding areas. And on the waterfronts, we can invite people to come and live and develop an urban area along the waterway, and then we can connect this to Seoul. And this can be an area where global citizens participate. So this is what I've been imagining. So this is one direction or one idea. Of course, there are the UN sanctions on North Korea, so there may be some constraints. But if we continue to discuss this idea and consider the international and national and the environmental aspects, then we can use our imagination and we can start all these preparations. So when the circumstances are right, this can become a reality. Likewise, we can make connections between urban and rural areas, and we can create more self-sufficient economy, local economies. So the agricultural farming in the urban setting, and by connecting these two, we can make advancement. So in short, focusing on the inter-Korean relations may have limits because it is only based on the sovereign state notion, and this is not appropriate when we think about the ecological aspect and the international community related aspect. So we, of course, have to be practical at the same time, but I think this is something that we can imagine in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation.
As I was listening to your presentation, I was able to understand the implications and the limits of the new Korean Peninsula regime. The fact that it is talking about a regime and a system, it is a big advancement. But when you think about the new climate regime and transition to renewable energy and ecological preservation, these aspects are not included in the new Korean Peninsula regime. And this is something that we need to improve, especially the new Korean Peninsula regime is a reflection of our understanding of the Korean Peninsula, and this is once again linked to our notion and utilization of the DMZ. And from the ecological and civilization perspective, we need to think about this. For the past several years, there have been a lot of active discussions on this. Now, when you think about the Korean Peninsula issues and the national issues, how can we address these issues from an ecological perspective? This is something that we need to increase our awareness and understanding. And the ecological belt that you proposed in your presentation was also very interesting. Thank you.
Next, we would like to talk about the potential of the Earth system. We have with us Professor Louis Kotze. Professor?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the kind invitation to contribute to this extremely interesting discussion and forum. I wish to reflect a little bit further on what Nathan Holtman has highlighted in his presentation, one of the key aspects, namely that of global justice and democracy. And I hope to share with you, admittedly from a fairly conceptual, theoretical perspective, what I think would be key in trying to strive towards more peaceful, a more peaceful coexistence with one another in the Anthropocene. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly done many, many things. In the most general of terms, I believe the pandemic is foregrounding and highlighting in a frighteningly stark way many of the key characteristics of the current global geological epoch that has become known as the Anthropocene. We actually needed a global pandemic to remind us that the human-dominated period in geological time that we are living in is in fact characterized by unprecedented and pervasive levels of injustice, global unevenness, ruthless exploitation and suffering, which we cannot continue to ignore simply because it is convenient to do so. Ignoring these concerns will perpetuate and even aggravate, I think, those conditions that are threatening the fragile state of relative peace we have been experiencing since the end of the last World War. Now, what are some of the characteristics of the Anthropocene that are illuminated by the COVID-19 pandemic? I think that the pandemic has exposed the significant divergence and diversity in our abilities to find safety, security, and protection, not only against the virus itself, but also against loss of livelihoods. It has revealed the very stark differences that exist, notably along racial, gender, and income lines, with respect to the abilities of people to be resilient and to bounce back. As the unequal production and distribution of vaccines show, the pandemic is raising questions about the lofty ideals of proclaimed global solidarity, which is now being exposed, I think, for the high rhetoric that it is. Rightly or wrongly, in times of existential crisis, people and countries first protect themselves. The pandemic is again highlighted the central importance being placed on the perceived ability of money or economic development in the language of the Sustainable Development Goals to quickly solve all structural problems and shocks. After all, extraordinary interventions in the form of economic stimulus packages have been agreed upon, almost always unanimously and swiftly, as a first response to preserving the tenacious status quo of a privileging neoliberal global economic system. Money, indeed, seems to make the world go around. Relatedly, I think the pandemic has exposed the, shall one say, disingenuous and unrealistic falsehoods of the global financial system, including specifically its pervasive power to artificially keep up appearances, with global stock markets being at an all-time high, despite the fact that there is little economic activity to justify such exuberance. Airlines are not flying, shops are closed all over the world, and millions of people have become unemployed. So there is no rational connection between what is happening on the ground and what is reflected in global stock markets currently. I think the pandemic has also exposed the capacity and the power of humans to bend rationality in order to accommodate hierarchies of power, as Angela Harris says. This is evident in rising populist politics and anti-rationalism movements that are spurred on by the rejection of objective science. Relatedly, the pandemic is also destabilizing sacred political ideals of human rights protection, liberty, democracy, and sovereignty, as the tumultuous Trump years have shown. while it also delegitimizes the patronizing hegemony of so-called world powers to demand from other states a level of acceptable behavior they are themselves not prepared to follow at home. Now, the pandemic has shown us that there are links between life and the Earth system. Life exploits its abiotic surroundings, as Sarah Connell says. Where Earth system equilibrium is upset, as it is by powerful Promethean humans in the Anthropocene, being fully in step with Earth system complex dynamics, there is bound to be a correction of some sort to re-establish such equilibrium. And perhaps on a more positive note, the pandemic has also shown us that we can, in fact, do what we thought impossible and change our ways if we are forced to do so. We can stop flying around the globe to attend a one-day workshop or a meeting. And we can buy local products instead of important ones, for example. But the one thing I believe the pandemic has managed to do particularly well is to show us that we are not all that powerful and invincible as we thought we were. The Anthropocene's powerful Promethean human is also a vulnerable subject. It is vulnerable not least because it impacts Earth system stability to such an extent that the quality and longevity of all life on Earth are being jeopardized, its own included. So if vulnerability could be understood in overtly simplified terms as the precarity found on the ground when hazards arrive, a precarity which also bears on the susceptibility of something or someone to damage, then humans have created a range of profound, potentially irreversible disasters, such as climate change, that dislodge Earth system harmony and cause precarity and damage to which humans and non-humans are increasingly susceptible. Even Anthropos, the Anthropocene's powerful human, cannot escape such vulnerability. Importantly, however, while we are all vulnerable, some are more vulnerable than others, especially the marginalized sectors of society that are constantly being othered by those less vulnerable through predatory, privileging structures of entitlement that are deeply embedded in the legal system, the political system, and the economic system. It is through these structures of entitlement that privileged humans have been eluding responsibility for our destructive actions, while deliberately and cunningly sowing the seeds of doubt, false scientific balance, and constructed denial and ignorance, serving as this does destructive agendas in a quest for prosperity for a selective, privileged few. The vulnerability of the human is therefore not and should not be understood as homogeneous or monolithic. Injustice, I think, is key to the Anthropocene and to an understanding of vulnerability in the Anthropocene. Deeply intertwined and mutually reinforcing practices of legally sanctioned extractivism, colonialism, imperialism, industrialization, and slavery, all exemplars of modern progress, to be honest, have been identified as key drivers of the Anthropocene and as generators of multiple injustices and vulnerability. And this is a toxic mix, making for a world order that is characterized by short-termism, egocentric self-satisfaction, and unrestricted consumption and growth at the expense of the marginalized and oppressed human and non-human world on which it depends to sustain its, ultimately, unsustainable metabolism. Despite the evidence that we might soon be facing a sixth mass extinction event, with the COVID-19 pandemic offering only a partial preview of what this might entail, human progress continues to deploy long-standing and pervasive ideologies and doctrines that are entrenched in legal, social, economic, and political systems, such as developmentalism, extractivism, neoliberalism, that all fetishize growth and technology as solutions to the socio-ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. Now, the exigencies resulting from human progress at all costs are reinforced by anthropocentric palliatives that humans have constructed and institutionalized to further privilege certain privileged humans, including, among others, the three-pillared approach to sustainable development and the so-called green economies, natural capital. All of these concepts are deeply embedded and have significant normative and political power, as we see, for example, in the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is palliatives such as these that legitimize at a very high normative and political level the type of unrestricted development that pushes vulnerable living beings' interests to the periphery of regulatory concern, while prioritizing social and economic development for some humans at the expense of both global Earth system stability and meaningful international solidarity between people. So despite the noble intentions that might have accompanied the initial adoption, auditory ideals such as sustainable development have been captured by irrational, elitist, and powerful economic and political forces to promote a new liberal agenda, which in turn causes inequalities, discrimination, exploitation, and ultimately a range of very deep, pervasive socio-ecological injustices. So it is difficult to evade the conclusion that the Anthropocene represents a crisis of human hierarchy that has also the potential to threaten the foundations of peace and stability, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but all across the world. For better or for worse, this is a crisis that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is now forcing us to confront head on, whether we like it or not. To conclude with perhaps a bit more of an optimistic view, I would suggest that a first step in confronting this crisis would be to recognize and fully embrace our collective vulnerability, and then to find ways to respond to such vulnerability. And one way to respond to our collective vulnerability could be to include within our social systems, such as the laws that we have, a guiding principle that recognizes Earth system vulnerability and our shared vulnerability as a living order. Unlike the principle of sustainable development, which, as you've heard, I'm deeply skeptical of, a principle of Earth system vulnerability has instead the potential to do three things, I think. First, it could level the playing field by foregrounding our shared vulnerability. We are all vulnerable, and therefore we are all equal. Second, the principle of Earth system vulnerability could demolish human-made hierarchies and illuminate pervasive patterns of human mastery over particularly vulnerable people and also over the non-human world, which would enable us to do something about this vulnerability. And thirdly, such a principle could foster, I think, a fertile scientific or epistemic, normative, and ethical space for thinking about the creation of other principles of care that could replace the predatory principles of sustainable development, new liberalism, and so forth. And some of these principles we still need to think about, but just to identify a few, I could think of the principle of sufficiency. If you have what is enough, that should be okay, you don't need more. the principle of humility, the principle of planetary integrity, of global solidarity, of interspecies justice, and perhaps even the principle of happiness. It is only once we recognize that we are all vulnerable that we can do something about this. And it is arguably only then that we can more constructively pursue a peaceful coexistence. Thank you very much.
네, 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor.
지구의 정복자라는 말이 있죠.
So we say that we have conquered the world. So during the Anthropocene, people are dominating the earth. But from the perspective of vulnerability, you have presented a very new perspective, and this new approach is quite inspiring.
불완전한 인간과 힘이라는
So,
제목도 있는데요.
there is a book titled Imperfect Humans and Power. So we are vulnerable, and although we are vulnerable, we are becoming the movers and shakers of the earth, making everything else vulnerable as well. And one of the ways to find solutions is not a way to open more inequality, to make the powerless more powerless and the powerful more powerful. I think that really resonated with us. And so you talked about sufficiency and humility as your ideas for the future, and earth integrity as well as interspecies justice. Thank you very much for your presentation.
법적 관점에서
Next,
환경
we're going to hear from Professor Rakhyun Kim, who is going to discuss ecological perspective and the Earth system.
네, 소개 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much for your introduction.
네덜란드
I am Rakhyun Kim.
대학교에서
I am teaching global environmental governance at Utrecht University.
철새 이동 경로
What I'm going to discuss in my presentation is how the two Koreas can be reconnected along the global flyway. I want to start my presentation with the word 분리 or division or separation. By definition, it means that the two sides are separated and divided. So they used to be one, but they're divided, and such division causes many problems. There's a disconnection between humanity and the environment, causing environmental problems, and this connection between people would lead to violence, pain, and conflict. And there are many reasons why we have these disconnections and divisions. And the answer is quite simple. We pay less attention to those who are far away from us, and out of sight, out of mind is a well-known expression. And such disconnection and division shows that we don't know the consequences of our action on faraway places. For instance, we throw away trash and we don't feel guilty about it because we don't know where these trashes would end up. Likewise, we don't feel guilty about consuming meat because we don't know what kinds of circumstances these animals are situated in, and we don't know much about them. So one environmentalist said that small things are beautiful when there's no distance between human and nature. And I believe the same applies to personal relations. When you think about people's lives, lives of people who are far away from us, we don't seem to care too much about them. And these kinds of perceptions may lead to war and violence. Once again, it really shows us that we should get rid of divisions and barriers. One such an example is the DMZ and the dividing line between the two Koreas. And this is the dividing line between people. 70 years, more than 70 years have passed since the division, but we have very limited channels of communication. There's lack of communication. And as we have lack of communication, we have not been able to build trust. And as a result, the two Koreas are still pointing guns at each other. And here in the DMZ, it is not only dividing the two Koreas, but also
고립시키고 있는
It is
장벽.
isolating North Korea from the rest of the world.
북에서 바깥을 향해
And
본다면
from North Korea, when they look outside, they would only see the barbed wires, and that's all they see.
공포, 분노,
And as a result of isolation, there's trust, there's mistrust, conflict, tension,
이런 관점에서 볼때
and
한반도의 지속
from this perspective, in order to build sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula, we need to reconnect the two Koreas. And one step further, we need to allow North Korea be reconnected to the rest of the world.
그러기 위해서는 장벽을
In order to do so, we need to break down the barriers, but there's no communication. So as time passes by, our commitment to breaking down the barriers is
우리와
weakening.
같이 분단되어 있었던 독일에서는
Germany used to be a divided country as well, but
한 사람의
there
실수가
was one small mistake by one person, which ultimately led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall.
그리고 동독과
And finally, the East Germany and West Germany were reunited.
한반도에도 이런 우연한 행운,
On the Korean Peninsula, such serendipity can happen, but this is also the result of continuous efforts. So we need to all make efforts together until such things happen. Now, what can we do right now?
DMZ라는 장벽을
We have this barrier called the DMZ. We may go around it, or we may make some hole for communication and connection, and we have to expand the size of it.
소통과 교류를 위한 노력들은
Indeed,
이미 다방면에서
in the past,
많은 사람들의 이해,
many people have been working hard to open up this channel of communication, not only at the government level, but also at civil society level with humanitarian aid. Many activities have been carried out.
최근 들어 더욱
And more recently, there's growing attention to the Green Detente, which is about building peace through environmental cooperation
환경 보전과 지속
to
가능한
preserve environment and promote sustainable peace. This is the topic that I'm going to delve into more in my presentation.
DMZ는 남과
The
북을 잘
DMZ
분리하고 있지만
divides the two Koreas.
하늘 나는 새를
But when you look at these wild birds, they do not recognize the DMZ.
화면에 보이는 새는
On the screen, you see
모두에게 너무나도 친숙한
very well-known
전
cranes.
세계에 고작 1,800여 마리 정도
These are rare species,
보호가 아주 중요한데
so they deserve
두루미들은
protection.
중국에서 보내고
They spend the summer in China, and when it gets cold, they fly down south through North Korea
두루미들에겐 DMZ
to South Korea. And for these birds, they do not know the dividing line on the Korean Peninsula.
남북을 자유로이 오가는
They fly between the two Koreas, and in order to protect these species, we need inter-Korean cooperation.
북을 이어주는
These cranes are indeed a symbol that can connect between the two Koreas.
DMZ에서 줌아웃해서
When you zoom out from the DMZ and take a look at the globe as a whole, you can see that there are the great flyways of migratory birds along East Asia. And this is East Asia Oceania flyway.
동남아시아로 지나 호주,
So it goes through Southeast Asia all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. And within the flyways, migratory birds will move around and they will spend the summer here and spend the winter there. And the Korean Peninsula is in a very important position in this great flyway because the Korean Peninsula is considered to be the hub for many wild birds.
이처럼 가까이서 봤을 때
So when you take a look at the DMZ closely, you only see the dividing line, but from far away, you don't see the dividing line, but rather the Korean Peninsula is at the center of this network of flyways and migratory routes.
플라이웨이의 접속점으로서의
As the connecting point of flyway, we have the DMZ, and this is the new perspective that we need to have in examining our DMZ.
이 DMZ 안에서도
Within the DMZ
플라이웨이 안에서
and within the flyway,
중요한 역할을 하는 것이 있는데
there are several important locations, especially the Han River estuary. The wetlands of Han River are homes and very important destinations for many migratory birds.
지금 보시는 새들은 큰
What you see here is the Toyo bird,
11,000km가
and they fly more than 10,000 kilometers. And they fly nonstop for a whole week, and they arrive at the Korean Peninsula. These long bills fly a long way, and even by airplane, it takes 12 hours. And then when they start, they will fly nonstop for a week and they will lose a lot of weight. So at the estuaries of Han River, they would stay and they will eat and then they will get rest so that they can fly all the way to their final destination in Siberia. But as you can see in the example of Saemangum, the wetlands of Han River, if these ecosystems are destroyed, then these longbills would lose their habitat and they would be extinct. As a result, the DMZ and the Han River is very critical for ecological purposes. And also, this area is significant for peace. On the right-hand side, you can see the demilitarized zone, and on the left-hand side, you can see the north limit line. But there's no dividing line in this river area because this is the only area where there's no official dividing line. It is a common waterways for both Koreas. According to the Armistice Treaty, it stipulates that there should be freedom of navigation along these waterways. And with the new declaration in 2018, the two Koreas decided to develop this area together. So I talked about sustainable peace and breaking down the barriers. And this can be a space where we can move away from the dividing lines and pursue joint interest. And what can we do? This is my idea. Here, we can consider this as the important place for the Great Flyway, and this downstream area of Han River can be preserved and preserved together between the two Koreas. To be more specific, the entire downstream area of the Han River can be designated as the Ramsar wetland or the transboundary Ramsar wetland. We can try to list this area as a Ramsar wetland. Ramsar is one of the longest environmental convention, especially it is all about protecting wetlands for wild birds. In 1997, Korea joined it, and in 2007, we hosted the COP convention for Ramsar Convention. And after several years of preparation, North Korea joined Ramsar Convention several years ago, and it is making all the preparation to be a full-fledged member. And designating the Han River as a Ramsar wetland can be a very important forum to facilitate Indo-Korean cooperation. And this would also provide a forum for the two Koreas to work in a multilateral way with many surrounding countries. So this will provide very good opportunities. The Great Flyway International Partnership Secretariat is located in Korea as well, so this is all the more meaningful. For two Koreas to designate this area as a Ramsar wetland, what do we need to do? And if such designation happens, what can we expect? First of all, the two Koreas need to have a joint survey of the ecological systems of the Han River estuary, and this would require working level cooperation between the two Koreas. And in addition to that, we need to have a channel of dialogue for environmental protection, and this channel of communication should be guaranteed its availability. Just because the husband and the wife have an argument doesn't mean that they should neglect their children. Likewise, even if there are political tensions, such channel of communication should remain open, and we should constant monitoring of this area area after the designation of Ramsar wetland, and this can also provide a good opportunity for the two Koreas to continue to break down the barriers. And through such exchanges, we can reopen the waterways along the Han River. There have been a lot of talks and projects about reconnecting the railways between the two Koreas. There were some successes, but there are many setbacks. But in reality, reopening the waterways may be easier than reconnecting the railways because, as I mentioned, the downstream of the Han River is open to both Koreas and there's no official division line. And if we open the waterways, then we can facilitate the development, economic development of the local economies. And as we designate this area as a Ramsar wetland, you may wonder how we can utilize the waterways for transport. But even though it is designated as the Ramsar wetland, the convention allows efficient and smart utilization of the water resources, and it includes sustainable economic development of the local community as well. So we may promote ecotourism by opening up the waterways for transport. So we can utilize the downstream area of the Han River and designate this area as a Ramsar wetland, and we can open up the waterways. Then this can be a symbolic place for inter-Korean relations, and it can also be promoted as a eco-tour destination, and this will lead to regional and local economic development, and this will also improve the pride of the local residents as well. Professor Koche and Professor Lee talked about Earth system jurisprudence, and this is the kind of paradigm that we need in Anthropocene. Now, when you think about the Earth system governance and Earth jurisprudence, what they want to achieve is indeed about breaking down the barriers and the dividing lines, so that we will have reconnection between people and nature, between people, and between countries and between communities, so that we can all be connected in an organic manner. And to do so, we need to approach the Earth as a single system. There are many dividing lines and disconnections, but there are dots that we can connect together. And by doing so, we can promote sustainable peace and environmental preservation at the same time. In that sense, we should not approach the DMZ as a symbol of division, but from the planetary perspective, we can consider the DMZ as a connecting point that can connect many different elements. So that is my idea that I wanted to share with you. I hope that my presentation would contribute to opening up our communication. Thank you very much for your attention.
네, 낙김 교수님.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation.
철망으로 가로막힌
There are barbed wires and disconnections along the DMZ, but it was very nice to see that there are no physical divisions on the waters along the Han River. So it was a very good reminder.
전지구적으로 날아다니는 새들이
There are birds who are flying across the borders, and they would come to the downstream of Han River, and they would take a rest, and they would stay there
이 DMZ 문제를
and make them their habitats. So from the ecological perspective and from the environmental perspective and from the planetary perspective, we can address these problems. Then we can make great achievements. And at the same time, he helped us open up and apply a new perspective by promoting the green detangte, or reconciliation. So it was a wonderful presentation.
새롭고
So we have listened to very new and innovative presentations. We will continue without a break,
20분 전에는 마치도록
but we will end before 6:20.
그린 데탕트와
So, connected to Green Detente, we will continue with the presentations or discussions on inter-Korean cooperation. We have with us National Assemblywoman Lee So-young. Can you hear me well? Good afternoon. Yes, we can hear you well. Well, it seems that I am very large on the screen right now. Good afternoon. I am Lee So-young, member of the National Assembly, and I am working in the committee related to energy. And within the ruling party, I am one of the people in charge of the policies until 2050. The topic for today is the net zero emissions by the two Koreas. Well, already in October, we have announced net zero by 2050. We are in the process of coming up with the implementation plans. So today, I would like to talk about how we can work together on the part of North Korea, South Korea, and the US to achieve net zero for North Korea. The new climate peace regime is the topic for today, and I believe that this is very relevant. Well, I would like to use the word South Korea and North Korea so that it's easier for the translators. Well, I have always talked about how we need climate cooperation between the US and the two Koreas. And I've talked about this since the presidential elections in the US last year. I believe that if we start cooperation concerning climate change, not only will it save humanity, but it could also help us pursue peace between the two Koreas. As you're well aware, the two Koreas thus far have conducted various economic cooperation, but we have not been able to receive full support from the international community. And because of political instabilities, we have not been able to continue our cooperation. But if we have climate cooperation between the two Koreas along with the US, it could be different for the following reasons. First, this is a trilateral cooperation. So we need to talk about the US perspective. President Biden, during his election, he has always talked about how the whole world needs to strengthen their response to climate change. And to quote from him, he said, he will encourage the world to respond to climate change. He will encourage states to strengthen their goals. And he has also stated that he will hold a climate summit within 100 days of being inaugurated. And he will prioritize climate issues for diplomacy, politics, and economy. So we need to make sure that North Korea takes climate action. And if we could encourage that, I believe that it will contribute to President Biden's efforts to have a climate structure. From the North Korean perspective, they are a signatory to the Paris Treaty, and they have handed in their NDC twice already. But the NDCs are based on support from advanced countries, and they do not have any detailed climate action yet. Chairman Kim has set various goals related to forestry, but there are no tangible results up until now. With the help of advanced countries such as South Korea, they wish to convert from old coal power plants to nuclear plants, and they also wish to replant their mountains, and that definitely will become a turning point for the North Korean economy. And if we take a look at the perspective of South Korea, with the support of the international community, we would be able to have economic cooperation and peace cooperation with North Korea if we could earn the support for climate cooperation. We have our MDC for 2030, and the international offset can be utilized for climate cooperation with North Korea, which would mean that we can minimize the financial investments for climate cooperation with North Korea, which can win the understanding of the people of Korea very easily. So, I believe that net zero climate cooperation between the US and the two Koreas would be a win-win-win choice for all three countries. Let me add some details. I believe that these contents can become a meaningful agenda for the April 22nd summit. Of course, the South Korean government is not officially considering this agenda yet. We don't have detailed information about the North Korean situation, but based on the open data, as of 2013, they are ranked at number 7 in terms of climate vulnerability. So they're very vulnerable. And as of 2019, they actually are emitting 42 million tons, which is about 6.5% of the emissions of South Korea. And compared to the US, it's about 0.8%. And the energy consumption is relatively low. As of 2018, if we take a look at energy provision, it's only 4.6% of South Korea. It's less than 5%. If we take a look at generation amount, it's about 4.4% of South Korea. So they actually emit about 7% of what South Korea emits, and they produce energy at about 5% of what Korea produces. North Korea handed in their NDC twice, and if we take a look at the 2016 NDC, they have set the goals for 2030 to be 3 to 4-fold increase compared to the BAU. So the tons will be at 168 million tons, and their goal is to reduce 8%. 8% is not an ambitious goal, but with the support of the advanced countries, they say that compared to the BAU, they will be able to reduce additionally 32%, and that will bring the total to 40%. If we take a look at the 2019 revised NDC, the BAU is calculated to be 219 million tons, and they said they will reduce 16.4%, and with the support of the advanced countries, they can reduce a total of 52%. And at that time, the cost for the 52% reduction is about $30 billion. So if we take a look at the BAU and the NDC, is probably exaggerated according to many people. Their emissions are not high right now, and so compared to what countries are announcing as being net zero until 2050, North Korea may be able to become net zero in 2040 or even before that. Concerning the areas for reduction, they are focusing on energy generation and forestry. North Korea has emphasized efforts for reforestation. For example, the official from the Ministry of Diplomacy participating in a forestry-related international organization has mentioned that North Korea has a massive project to reforest the whole country. And they actually have a war on deforestation. So you can see that they're using the word war. And at COP22, at a high-level meeting speech, they have emphasized their response to climate change through reforestation. If we take a look at the 2016 NDC of North Korea, they mentioned that with the support of advanced countries, there are various ways to make reductions. First, to reduce the waste from transmission to 6% and to have solar energy worth 1 giga, to have a 5 megawatt wind power in the west and additional 5 million megawatt wind power. And there are many households that use coal power, but that can be changed to heat power and other energy effective measures. In supporting these efforts, I believe that the US and the two Koreas can achieve net zero for North Korea together. What we need to focus on is that the NDC for 2030 submitted by South Korea includes the international offset of 16.2 million tons. Before the signing of the Paris Agreement, we handed in the NDC to the UN, and we actually mentioned that 100 million tons will not be reduced in Korea, but it will be an international offset, which is 1/3 of the total amount. In 2018, we had a revision of the NDC, and the international offset amount was reduced, but still 16.2 million tons are included as international offset. This means that in order to achieve our goals for 2030, we will need to have at least 16.2 million tons outside of Korea every year. According to the calculation of the Korean government, concerning the reduction costs and the carbon credit set overseas, this could be different. But according to estimation of the government, 16.2 million tons of international offsets would call for tens or hundreds of billions. And so, such international offsets are usually planned for Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. But if we conduct this in North Korea, then we can achieve not only climate action, but also peace. Currently, according to the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, North Korea is a part of our country. We are one country. But if we take a look at the UNFCCC, North Korea is outside of Korea's inventory, so this can be used as international offsets. So I tried to share with you the big picture as well as changes in perspective. Many of the speakers have provided us with the big picture, and I would like to talk about this detailed. In April 22nd, we will have a climate summit, and now we need to start the agenda for April 22nd. So concerning this agenda that I mentioned, I look forward to the interest and support of many people, which will contribute to reducing carbon emissions around the world, as well as achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So for the new peace regime and the peace on the Korean Peninsula can all be linked together to this initiative that you have mentioned. I believe that this is a very important issue for Korea.
Next, I'm going to invite Professor An for his comments. So we need to wrap up in time, so I hope that you will make your remarks brief. As introduced, I am An Byung-jin from Gyeonggi University. Let me make my comments very brief and ask a question to each speaker. It may be by accident, but we're discussing the new normal in the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are many different aspects that have been covered in this panel session. So this can become a very nicely edited book because we talked about a new philosophy and the politics of vulnerability proposed by Professor Koche. And then between the US and China, there are many strategic cooperation we can pursue, which was mentioned by Dr. Holtman. And when it comes to the new Korean Peninsula regime and its limitation, there was critical evaluation and a bold proposal by Professor Lee. And then there were some strategic proposals by Professor Kim Lak-hyun and National Assembly person Lee So-young. Very interesting proposals. So when we put them all together, it can be a very nicely orchestrated, edited book of different chapters. And if we have time, I don't know if we have time for this session, but next time, I hope that we will be able to discuss the philosophical aspect that was mentioned by Professor Koche. He mentioned about vulnerability. Professor Koche has written the Global Environmental Constitutionalism, which is a completely new framework. It is a completely new legal framework that he wrote a book about it. Now, this new philosophy about vulnerability and the guiding principles, I wonder how these can lead to a new legal framework. It could be linked to human rights conventions or other aspects, and I wonder how it can be expanded. I would love to talk about this for hours, but I hope that Professor Koche will one day write about this in his book. Professor Boshelman is also a friend of mine, and Professor Nedelsky talked about the limitations of the U.S. Constitution. And maybe we can apply the notion and the philosophy of vulnerability in discussing these very important topics. Moving on to Professor Lee's presentation, I can say that his idea is very different and very new when you think about all the existing discussions. We have upcoming elections and there is growing bipolarization in the Korean politics, and his idea can be a new vision for all of us. And I think that we can discuss how to promote this new idea that can encompass both political ideologies. And so maybe National Assembly person Lee So-young can make this proposal to President Moon. We can add and improve the new Korean Peninsula regime by reflecting all the comments that were made in this session. And finally, Professor Kim Lak-hyun's proposal was very interesting. Recently, in the areas of environment, North Korea has been quite reluctant in participating in global cooperation. But this is something that we can try. And Professor Holtman, he sent us a pre-recorded video, so I will not be able to ask a question to him. And next time, I hope that Professor Holtman will write an article or publication in the future. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Professor An, thank you very much.
여러 가지 얘기가 오늘로 끝나지
I hope that the discussions that we have started today will not end here, but we hope that it will continue into the future.
날아다니는 새한테는
So for a flying bird, there is no division. For a river flowing, there is no DMZ.
자연의 권리적 측면,
We need to take a look at the DMZ from the perspective of nature. We need to take a look at the DMZ from the perspective of the animals living there. And only then can we expand our concept of inter-Korean cooperation. That is what we have seen through today's session. We have taken a look at the new climate peace regime, as well as the issue of overcoming the different systems and institutions that we have in place. We have had many participants online, and they did ask some questions, and I would like to introduce a question from them. That is related to the new climate peace regime that we are discussing here today. And the Green New Deal that Korea is preparing for. The Green New Deal is a global transformation, and I believe that all of this is linked to the ecosystem, and I wonder how we can find solutions. So we are pressed for time, but at the same time, this question is very difficult to answer at this point in time. So let us leave that as food for thought and continue our dialogue into the future. Thank you very much to the speakers and panelists for your participation, and I thank you for your participation.